Right now, somewhere on the planet, someone is lighting a joint. They probably think they're tapping into one of humanity's oldest rituals. Cavemen around a fire, ancient shamans in a trance. A habit older than agriculture itself. They're wrong. Wrong by almost 200,000 years. Modern humans existed for nearly 200,000 years before anyone, anywhere, got high on cannabis. No cave painting shows it. No early campfire ritual involved it. For almost the entire span of human existence, this particular door to an altered mind simply didn't open. Why? That question takes you somewhere stranger than you'd expect. Cannabis itself is ancient. People in East Asia were growing it more than 10,000 years ago. But they weren't smoking it. They were using it the way you'd use rope, or canvas, or birdseed. Fiber for clothing, oil for food. The plant was everywhere. The high was not. Wild cannabis, left alone, doesn't carry much THC, the chemical responsible for its psychoactive effect. Smoke wild hemp and mostly what you'll get is a headache and a faint herbal smell. So when early humans wanted altered states, they reached for other things instead. Fermented fruit, certain mushrooms, the rhythm of fire, drums and exhaustion. Cannabis just sat in the fields, doing none of that. So when did it change? In 2019, a team of archaeologists opened 10 wooden bowls pulled from a 2,500-year-old cemetery high in the Pamir Mountains, in what's now western China. The site is called Jirzankal. Inside the bowls were small stones, scorched by intense heat. Braziers, vessels built for burning something during funerals at brutal altitude. Researcher Yimin Yang and his team ground the residue from those bowls into powder and ran it through a mass spectrometer. What came back surprised them. 9 of the 10 bowls had burned cannabis. And this wasn't the low THC kind used for rope and cloth. It was unusually potent. Mourners standing over these braziers 2,500 years ago were almost certainly inhaling psychoactive smoke during burial ceremonies. That's the earliest solid, chemically verified evidence of humans smoking cannabis specifically to feel different. Not to make fabric. To change consciousness. But here's where it actually gets strange. Co-author Robert Spengler of the Max Planck Institute has a theory about why this particular cannabis turned out so strong. The Pamir Plateau sits at extreme elevation. Up there, plants face brutal stress, thin air, intense sunlight, freezing nights. Spengler suspects that stress pushed the cannabis into producing far more THC than it would at lower altitudes. Almost as a side effect of just trying to survive. The plant wasn't trying to get anyone high. It was trying to survive a mountain. Humans simply noticed what came out of that struggle and built a ritual around it. So the first stoned ancestors weren't lounging in some lowland paradise. They were standing in thin, freezing mountain air, burying their dead, breathing in the unintended byproduct of a plant fighting for its life. Does that change how the story feels? Around the same region, slightly earlier, archaeologists found something just as striking. In tombs near Turpan, in what's now China's Xinjiang region, excavators uncovered nearly 2 pounds of cannabis buried alongside a man believed to be a shaman of the ancient Gushi culture. That burial dates back roughly 2,700 years. The chemical signature suggested the plant had been deliberately selected for its pharmacological effects, though no one could confirm exactly how it was consumed. No braziers, no clear smoke residue, just a generous, intentional quantity of cannabis placed beside a body. 2 different sites, 2 different methods, the same conclusion. Somewhere around 2,500 to 2,700 years ago, cannabis stopped being just a crop and started being a drug. And it isn't only buried residue telling this story. Written history backs it up, almost exactly. Around 440 B, the Greek historian Herodotus, often called the father of history, described a nomadic people called the Scythians, who lived across that same vast stretch of Eurasian steppe. After a burial, he wrote, Scythian men would crawl into a small felt tent, throw hemp onto a dish of red-hot stones, and breathe in the smoke that rose up. He said the vapor made them shout for joy, delighted, in a ritual that served instead of washing with water. For centuries, that was just a second-hand story, impossible to verify. Then, in 1929, archaeologists excavating frozen burial mounds at a site called Pazyryk on the border of Siberia and Kazakhstan found something that matched it almost exactly. A wooden tent frame, copper sensors holding charred stones, a small fur bag packed with preserved cannabis seeds. The written account and the buried evidence told the same story, independently, separated by roughly 2,500 years. Notice the pattern forming here. Jirzankal, cannabis smoke, at a funeral. Yanghai, cannabis, buried beside a shaman. Pazyryk, cannabis smoke, used specifically to purify mourners after a death. 3 different sites, 3 different peoples, hundreds of miles apart, and every single time the discovery of getting high shows up in the same place, standing over the dead. It wasn't only happening in Central Asia, either around that same general era on 2 stone altars at a site called Tel Arad. In the ancient kingdom of Judah, archaeologists found cannabis residue burned as part of a religious ritual, thousands of miles from the Pamir Mountains. Different culture, different religion, same plant treated the same way, burned, inhaled, and called sacred. But that's still not the strangest part of this story. For decades, some archaeologists claimed ritual cannabis burning stretched back 5,000 years across Central Asia, twice as old as the Pamir find. It's a compelling claim. Deep antiquity. The kind of detail that makes a documentary feel epic. It's also most likely wrong when later researchers retested those older plant remains. The TC levels came back low. Too low to produce any real psychoactive effect. One researcher who studies the region admitted that he and his colleagues actually tried smoking and eating wild varieties from those older sites, hoping to feel something. They didn't. No buzz. Just smoke and disappointment. So the 5,000-year story collapses under its own residue. What survives the testing is the Pamir evidence, and it points to a far later, far narrower window than anyone expected. Why does any of this matter to you? Scrolling through a feed thousands of years later? Because it reframes something you probably assumed was permanent. You likely pictured cannabis use as a constant thread running through all of human history, prehistoric, primal, baked into the species from the start. The truth looks more like a recent invention, a narrow accident of geography, geology, and grief stumbled into at high altitude by people burying their dead. Botanist Mark Merlin, who reviewed the Pamir findings, put it plainly. Cannabis had been valued for thousands of years as fiber and food long before anyone valued it for its high. The psychoactive use wasn't the plant's origin story. It was a much later chapter, bolted onto something already ancient. And once that chapter started, it spread fast. Nicole Boivin, who directs research connected to the Pamir study at the Max Planck Institute, has pointed to the trade routes threading through this exact region, the same paths that would later carry silk, spices, and ideas across continents. A psychoactive plant, once it proved itself at a funeral on a freezing mountain, didn't stay on that mountain. It moved. Here's the part that should really sit with you. You did not inherit this habit from some unbroken evolutionary thread reaching back to your earliest ancestors. You inherited a very specific, very recent cultural transmission. One funeral, one mountain, one group of grieving mourners standing over a brazier, breathing in something their plant had never quite produced before. That moment got copied. Then copied again. Across a few thousand years and several thousand miles, until it eventually reached you. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If this particular altered state is only a few thousand years old, what does that say about the urge sitting underneath it? Because the urge itself is much, much older than the plant. Humans have been chasing altered consciousness for as long as there's been a human mind capable of wanting one. Fermented fruit, eaten too long after falling. Smoke inhaled around a fire for hours at a time. Rhythmic drumming, sustained long enough to blur the edges of ordinary awareness. Even sleep deprivation, used deliberately in ritual to crack open a different kind of perception. None of that required cannabis. None of it required TCC at all. What did it require then? A brain built to seek a shift, a break from the baseline, a different channel, tuned in briefly, then tuned back out again. Cannabis didn't create that desire. It just became, for a narrow slice of human history, one of the easiest dials within reach. And maybe that explains why it kept showing up at funerals in the first place. Grief is one of the most disorienting states a brain can enter. People have always looked for some way to dull it, slow it down, or step outside of it, even briefly. A few thousand years ago, in 3 unrelated corners of the ancient world, someone reached for smoke instead of silence. So when you watch someone light a joint today, you're not watching something primal in the way you probably assumed. Are you? You're watching the tail end of a much older story. One that has almost nothing to do with the plant itself and almost everything to do with what's underneath it. A drive to step outside your own head for a while, expressed through whatever tool happened to be lying around. Sometimes that tool was a drum. Sometimes it was hunger and fermented fruit, eaten by accident. For the last 2,500 years or so, in certain places, it's been smoke curling up off a heated stone. The plant is the costume. The need underneath it is the actor. So here's what's actually strange about getting high. It isn't how old the habit is. It's how new. Somewhere right now, someone is lighting a joint, thinking they're connecting to something ancient and unbroken. They're not entirely wrong. The urge they're chasing really is ancient, older than language, older than fire, maybe even older than your species itself. But the specific tool in their hand? That's barely a blink in human time. A few thousand years old, discovered by accident on a freezing mountain beside the dead. Not quite as old as they think, just old enough to feel that way. And maybe that's the real lesson buried in all that smoke and residue. The tools we reach for to escape ourselves keep changing. The reason we reach for them at all hasn't changed in a very, very long time.